Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another one of our monthly chats. Steve's here again, as he's
Hello.
always. I can't get rid of him. I've tried. But yeah, we're going to be talking about somewhat of a hot topic today in the tabletop role-playing game world. So if you want to hear two people having lukewarm takes on the hottest topic in town, you've come to the right place. But first, we do have the small matter, Steve, of updating our TTRPG Accountabilityometer. The patent is pending on that title. It might not slip off the tongue quite as easily, but it's what we got for now. Last time we checked in, we were 2 games down. I've got a long-running, well, I say long-running, about 5 sessions of my way into the Between, which I'm loving. You're pretty deep into Traveller now. Your season is up and running. It's all very good. You should check that out, definitely. And I've made a little bit of further progress with my list, as I have played 7 Murders Till Midnight. And now, I said to everyone in this the preview episode we did at the start of the year, when we laid out these games that we wanted to play, that 7 Murders Till Midnight would probably be the next game that people saw me play on the channel. Now, spoilers, that's not going to happen, because this game is not ready for me. I'm not going to say it's not very good, because I just don't think I'm that qualified to say whether it's very good or not, but I didn't really chime with it. I did tease in that episode that I had an amazing idea for a concept for executing it as an actual play, which I'll share with you now, because it's not going to happen. Essentially, it's a journaling game. You play an investigator trying to solve 7 murders and catch a serial killer, and the journal part of the game is you writing down your notes in any kind of form you want, like a diary or whatever. Now, I messaged Steve and said, I think I've got a great idea for this. It might push the boundaries of what an actual play is capable of. And my idea was to have my investigator be a podcaster and the journaling aspect of the game be a true crime podcast, but set within my own podcast, a kind of podcast within a podcast, if you will. I thought it was a pretty good idea. I played the first 2 murders, and I thought, yes, I think this definitely could work. Then I played Murders 3, 4, and 5, and I was like, I don't think this works quite as well as it could. And then played it through to the end, and I was like, it doesn't actually work at all. And I think that the game is slightly muddled about what it wants to be and what it wants to do. You're given a lot of prompts that are generated by playing cards, and it's really hard to make them hang together. And I'm someone who specializes in joining the dots between very disparate bits of subject matter. But the first couple of murders I could link. There was one kind of set up this creepy guy who had like a plague doctor's mask on, and he'd done this murder that I'd stumbled upon, and then the second murder happened, and it was, I think, generated that he was a corrupt city official. And then I tied those first 2 details together of this being someone who's perhaps trying to rid society of these corrupt people. And then the third murder was just like totally the circumstances around it and the circumstances under which the body was found and the details just had no relevance at all to the first 2 murders. But the prompts kept saying, this can't be a coincidence. And it started to feel quite a lot like a coincidence that these were just unrelated murders that were all just weird that I happened to be stumbling upon, which made me think, am I the murderer? Is this me doing this? And yeah, it has quite a lot of weird problems, and I think maybe it's because I've been playing the Between so much, I might have been spoiled by the genius of the clue and investigation mechanics in that game, that there is no kind of clue mechanic in 7 Murders Till Midnight, even though it tries to have one. It says define a clue and then just say how it relates to what you're doing, and it's just so vague and kind of intangible that it's so hard to pull all those threads together to make anything of it. And ultimately I kind of played through it, and it was kind of like an underwhelming experience. And also it had a really weird thing where it was like, it kind of gave you the option like to have hate crimes in your game. Like it gave you the option of, when you were trying to find out who the victims were, of like it being a marginalized group. And I was like, and then it says under the text, like, if you don't want this in your game, then don't pick this one. And I was like, why is this in here? Like, I don't know if there's just like an oversight, or they needed kind of some sensitivity consultants, or like, I don't know who is wanting to include that in their game. It just seemed odd. But anyway, I played it. It's ticked off the list. And yeah, I'm not going to say don't play it. Give it a go. I spent like £8 on it. I don't mind. It's fine. It's a pretty book. We've all got them in our collection, I'd imagine. But yeah, enough about what I've done. The pair of us, fans of this podcast, will know that me and Steve played Dead Belt. We also ticked off one of Steve's in a duo, and that was really fun, wasn't it?
It was a lot of fun. Yeah, I really enjoyed playing Dead Belt, and I feel like I was a little apprehensive going into it, just because the couple of solo games that I played by myself beforehand to get a handle on the rules did not end well. Spoiler alert, I died multiple times. And I took from that a healthy fear of being in the void of space and running out of gas. So the fact that we survived that and successfully explored and salvaged a bird was quite thrilling and quite satisfying. And I was really happy with how it went, because we had kind of talked beforehand that, like, well, what if we just do this first bird and like nothing happens, like we find the payoff, or we don't find the payoff, but like nothing really happens. And I feel like we had almost every single thing happen that could, like, anything that could go wrong did go wrong. And the ship, you know stuff happened. I'm not going to spoil it here, go watch it. Stuff happened. And I'm really, like I said, pleased with how it turned out and pleased with the response. And I think, I don't know how you feel, Matt, but I think we're going to play it again.
Definitely. It's going to be a game that we will dip into, perhaps when we get to months where we don't have like a defined topic, or we don't have any particular feelings about what we want to talk about. We can just throw down a game of a Dead Belt, because I really enjoyed it. It was nice and easy to get on the table. The visual side of it worked using Roll20. And also, I think it's funny that you said you kind of basically made the case that it was actually a pretty good showcase for the game, I felt, that we made. And there was quite a lot of people in the comments who were like, well, I've had this, but I didn't really get it, and now I'll give it a go, having seen you two do it.
Yeah.
The one thing you didn't learn from that game is the co-op rules. In the intro, Steve laid out in real detail, because it says the game it says a solo game on the front, and in the video I was like, it says solo game, why are two of us playing? Then Steve laid out all of the co-op rules that would have really helped us, and we used precisely 0 of them. So I cut that whole section out. I think 2 minutes of the co-op rules explanation of that video is now in the on the cutting room floor, because we never used them. And I'm stunned that we made it through that, that scenario. And also, I can't imagine how much more punishing that game is in solo mode, because we covered a lot of ground and both nearly completely ran out of gas.
Yeah.
To do it, you don't get any more gas when you do it solo. It's pretty harsh. So I really enjoyed it. I think a lot of the people who watched it enjoyed it, and the response is really great. So I think we will definitely do some more of that. But
absolutely,
when I said we'll do it when we have nothing like particular to talk about, this month we do have something particular to talk about, and it's an interesting topic, because we are going to talk about Daggerheart. Now, Daggerheart, for those of you who don't know, is a game that is being tested currently. It's in beta testing by Darrington Press, the people who are behind the publishing outlet of the Critical Role show that some of you, well, you'll all know it. If you don't, then how? I'm not sure you don't know, but yeah, they have, due to the well-publicized licensing problems with Wizards of the Coast. Was that last year? It feels like a long time ago.
It was January or February of 2023. Yeah.
We won't go into the details of that, but because of that, a lot of D&D creators are looking at maybe doing their own thing, because they made a living out of using someone else's system, and it looks like that's not going to be viable for them anymore. We've talked before about the MCDM role playing game. Steve's super interested in trying out the test version of that this year, and getting into the full game next year. So you're going to see quite a lot of these D&D. I don't want to say D&D killers, or like D&D alternatives, I think we should probably call them, coming out. And the reason that we're talking about it is because the playtest dropped, I think, 2 weeks ago now, and it caused a bit of a stir. We initially got it. We both kind of skimmed through it, and I messaged Steve and was like, are we going to talk about this? Like, it would be interesting to talk about, but is this for us to talk about? This is not a game. We're not looking for an alternative to D&D. Steve might be with his group, but like, it's not something particularly that interests us. And the show that we do talks a lot about solo or co-op or like, low player count games. But we kind of ended up thinking, well, there's something there to talk about. And we were a little bit kind of, are we going to do this or not? And very non-committal in the way that we are. Like, there was almost a point where we were kind of resigned, like, are we going to have to talk about this? And I think we ended up deciding not to. But then two things happened. One, I actually read the entire 377-page or whatever it is playtest document. And two, Steve actually played it. So we thought that after those two things, it would definitely be worth talking about, because I have a lot of thoughts about it, and Steve, having played it now, I'm sure you have too. And full disclosure, we've already recorded this episode once, and due to a technical error, we lost the sound on half of it. But the fun thing is, we both have more thoughts since then, and it's interesting that it's spread out into the community a bit more, and people are now have had a bit of time to get their hands on it and play some games, and I feel like the response has been pretty interesting. How have you found the response, kind of like in the community and online, external to what we think about the game and our experiences with it? What have you found to be the main takeaways from people who have absorbed this playtest or even played it?
Yeah, I feel like I've seen a lot of different takes on it, and I feel like they range from like, this is really cool, to and I think it's interesting because it is a beta test that people are having such strong reactions to it, and I think partially like that's by design, right? Like, you want to have strong reactions to a beta version of your game, because then you can say, okay, well, they reacted very positively to this stuff, so maybe that stuff's working, and then they're not reacting as positively to this stuff, so now we have to decide, like, is this core to our identity as game designers, as game company, publisher, and it's something that we want to stick to, or that's something that we can carve out and change, or carve out and get rid of. So I think it's been very interesting to watch the response in the community, and maybe I have also just kind of missed it, but I feel like there was a flurry of activity in the first week, and then I feel like I haven't seen a whole lot more conversation about it on like the main RPG Reddit or anything like that. I feel like I'm seeing a lot fewer posts about Daggerheart in the 2 or 3 weeks since the release of the playtest than we did in the first week, which I think in and of itself is a really interesting, potentially telling observation, because does that indicate that like the people who were interested in it tried it, and then the conversation has just kind of gone back to D&D and the Blades in the Dark and Powered by the Apocalypse games as alternatives.
Mm.
So I don't know. What are your thoughts on the response?
I found the response really interesting because it seemed to make both sets of people that would be interested in it equally as angry, or equally as annoyed. So I think the interesting thing is trying to figure out what's trying to be achieved with this game
Yeah.
and who it's for. And it's offered up as an alternative to D&D for the reasons that we've already discussed. They kind of need to find another system to play that will make them as much, if not slightly less money than they were, making, like using D&D as their system of choice. Because
Yeah,
this is principally being designed as the in-house game for Critical Role, right?
I think so.
They've already got one game out, Candela Obscura, which is already out, and people have got it. And yeah, some people seem to like that. But this is going to be their main fantasy adventure, facsimile of D&D.
Yeah.
Now, the interesting thing is that, and I think we said this when we've talked about it previously, that when we talked about the MCDM game, we were saying that it's got to be different enough from D&D to keep people who like D&D interested, but it's also got to have enough that it's got to be the same but different, has it? It's got to have enough D&D about it whilst being different enough to set itself apart, because ultimately the fans really don't care. They'll play whatever, they'll play D&D. They're not losing money from the licensing issues. They might have a moral stance against Wizards of the Coast and their business practices and whatever, but ultimately it's not affecting their livelihoods. So if they want to stick with D&D, they will. So it's interesting that what Daggerheart tries to do is it tries to take a more narrative approach while still being a party of people tooling up and fighting monsters. And it's really interesting to see and we'll get into this when we start looking through the book in a bit more detail, what they've chosen to take from other games and what aspects of other games they've tried to work in to, make that approach possible. And it was really interesting to see the diehard D&D fans who either only ever play D&D or only ever watch Critical Role play D&D being absolutely baffled by narrative first game mechanics.
Yeah.
And then it was also interesting to see people who perhaps have played other games who perhaps weren't interested in playing D&D or playing, or being interested just watching the performance aspect of Critical Role rather than being interested in the game they're playing. Being like, well, yeah, obviously, like this is really these things have been around for a long time, and then the other people saying, well, I've never seen any of these things. This is revolutionary, and it was kind of hard to watch in a way because, like, you do not know until you know, right? You will experience something for the first time, and it doesn't matter if you experience it 10 years ago or now. Like, just because you listen to a band 10 years ago, it doesn't make them any more valid than me listening to them now. I just didn't hear them before now. It's fine. Don't worry about it. And being sniffy about that is annoying. And there was quite a lot of that.
Yeah.
But then also, what I was pleased about is there was, from a lot of parts, almost this kind of genuine celebration of how much they'd tried in this playtest document, because the two things that we'll get into in the main about Daggerheart is, firstly, this is very much a playtest. This is a beta, right? There's so much in here that probably won't make it into the finished game, and they really kind of have gone for throw a lot of mud and see what sticks, right? On the screen now, you'll see the touchstones listed for this game.
Hmm.
And they have listed, amongst other games, Apocalypse Keys, Apocalypse World, Blades in the Dark, City of Mist, Genesis, Lady Blackbird, Masks, The Quiet Year, and Wild Sea as their influences. And then below that, they actually list bits that they have taken directly from some of those other games. And those are some pretty disparate games.
Hmm.
And trying to bolt the elements of those games into a D&D adventuring, combat heavy chassis is a real challenge. And there are some things in here that I don't think work very well. And there are some things in here that I'm like, that's a pretty interesting concept. And when I read the game through in its entirety, I was very surprised at how much of it I thought was genuinely like a fun addition to
Hmm.
to what they were trying. But then I was also, my overriding concern about this game is that it's going to end up not being enough of either thing, and is going
Yeah.
to end up falling between two stools. And I think that's why I text you when I first flicked through the document. When we were sitting on the fence about whether to discuss this or not, I just said to you, like, I think this doesn't do enough of either thing.
Yeah.
But having read the document through in its entirety, my overriding feeling is, there's a good game in here somewhere, I think. And I don't know if that game's for me. I don't actually think this game is for me, even if
Hmm.
it comes out incredibly polished. I'm just not that interested in fantasy, like fantasy exploring games, delving dungeons and all that kind of stuff. I'm just not that bothered.
Hmm.
And if I am, there is a bunch of other games that take a completely different approach to it that I would try first. But yeah, that was my biggest kind of takeaway instantly, that it would end up being not enough of anything. Do you think the game's identity is clear enough from this playtest, and having played it?
I don't, because we talked a lot about who this game was made for at our table. And I think the thing that I've come away from with it is that I think it's in some ways made to introduce people to RPGs as a like introductory thing, or, and I think maybe this is more interesting, but it is designed to introduce D&D players to their second RPG. And I think there's a lot of, like you said, a lot of interesting narrative things that they try to introduce, but they mechanicalize it more than a Powered by the Apocalypse game. And I found myself as I was running the game kind of struggling with that a little bit, because I wanted to play it as it was written, and my instincts kept going like, well, I'm just going to get rid of this like fear mechanic, because I don't want to have to wait until I earn a currency from the player's rolls before I introduce complications and challenges into the adventure.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think a lot of that comes from the hours upon hours of Ironsworn that I've played, where pretty much every time you pick up the dice, you're introducing some sort of complication or opportunity into the narrative. And so it's just become ingrained in me that, like, okay, well, you're rolling the dice, so something interesting has to happen. And I felt a number of times, I'm sure we'll get into the details of the like the mechanics, but like I felt hampered sometimes as a GM, that I was waiting for fear to be generated for me to make something dramatic happen.
Mm.
And so then looking back on it later, I was like, I wonder if this is essentially a tutorial for, okay, you've played D&D. which is a more mechanical first style of gaming. Like, I'm going to roll a perception check. Okay, you roll the dice. Oh, I get an 18. All right, this is what you see. As opposed to a more fiction first of you're walking through, you see this, that, and the other thing. Like, okay, well, I'm going to look closer at that thing. All right, well, roll your, whatever the gather information or whatever the role is. I felt a little bit like the fear system and the hope system too was a like tutorial of like, all right, you've earned some currency. Now you can turn that currency in to take control of the narrative for
Mm.
a moment. And that didn't really work for our table because we already do that. My local group here is mostly a D&D group, but they humor me from time to time and allow me to inflict indie games on them. And and we've played many indie games that they've really enjoyed. And so when we started playing Daggerheart and getting into it, there were definitely moments where players were like, "Oh, this reminds me of, Blades in the Dark and like these different systems that we've played before." But then there were other times where they were like, "Well, I don't have enough points to spend on this thing." And I'm like, yeah, sucks to suck.
Yeah.
No, I mean, it's just like I had one player who throughout the whole system, and I don't know if you want to talk about anything else before we jump into the mechanics, but uh, I've got things to say about the hope and fear
Well,
system.
I
So,
mean, I was going to say I've got up on screen now, like right at the front of the rule book, and we will get into the mechanics.
mhm,
But right at the front of the rule book, one of the first things that really not shocked me, but that I kind of noticed straight away was it has player principles at the start of the book, exactly like you would find in 99% of Powered by the Apocalypse games.
mhm,
And some of the principles are exactly the same. Play to find out what happens, address the characters and address the players, be a fan of your character in the journey, build the world together. And then there's also GM principles that are later on, and they actually list some GM moves in the rule book, and things like draw maps, leave blanks are there. Those things that we've talked about.
mhm,
I was quite interested to see them right there at the front of the book, because that's a very clear delineation from what you'd expect to see in D&D or a Pathfinder book. These things right up front of how we're all going to play the game, and how, for I imagine a lot of people who have only played D&D, or what I found really funny about the playtest is that it mentions D&D a couple of times, like in the inspirations, the influences part at the start, especially for fourth edition D&D.
mhm.
But it keeps saying this phrase. Players of other role playing games may not be used to this, and it's like so euphemistic. It's almost like kind of like he who should not be named.
Yeah.
Like they won't say it, but like that's their audience they're speaking to, and I think that it's interesting to see this set out in a way that for a big proportion of gamers who read this will see this for the first time and be really excited by it, in the same
Yeah.
way that I was when I read I think probably Apocalypse World or Dungeon World would have been the first one that I read, probably Dungeon
Mhm,
World. And seeing these things are just like, here's not 50 pages of how you get started, breaking down your character and the stats and everything they mean. Here's the ideas that you are going to hold sacred in your game, and they are all brimming with creative possibility.
mhm.
So I was really interested to see that.
Yeah.
But then you have this friction with this game, because it has a lot of these narrative first um, principles, but then a lot of the mechanics seem to hinder that, and not particularly support that as well as other systems. And when I say other systems, I mean specifically Powered by the Apocalypse systems, where there are
Yeah.
generally 3 results of dice rolls possible. There is, a failure, a success, and a mixed success.
Yeah.
Now, what they have gone for in Daggerheart is quite a cool system when you on paper it's very cool.
Yeah.
It borrows very heavily from Genesis. I've got a lot of experience Genesis, well, what's now known as the Genesis system, but the first system I think it was used for was the Fantasy Flight Games Star Wars RPG, which was the first campaign I ever ran. It was an Edge of the Empire campaign. It uses custom dice with lots of symbols on them that you interpret, like kind of looking at tea leaves every time you roll the dice, try to interpret these symbols to mean, successes with threat and advantage and all kinds of stuff. I actually think that, if I'm not mistaken, that also comes from the old Warhammer Fantasy role-playing game, I think, which had custom dice where it had like a symbol on it that there was even right down to like there was a symbol of a sword, which meant something to do with a weapon, like you drop your sword or whatever, or your enemy, can't get their shield out or whatever. I think that that wasn't the first time something like that had been used, but this definitely borrows from it. Now, it uses D12s. We've talked before. D12's a great dice, isn't it, Steve?
Love D12s.
Everyone loves a good D12.
Yeah.
And you roll 2 in 2 different... Well, in fact, do you want to break down the mechanics, please, for every result? And I'll bring it up on screen.
Yeah. So you roll 2d12 and typically add something, your ability, and then there are something called experiences as well, which are additional bonuses. And this was actually something that I really liked about the system, was you had these experiences and they were just little keywords. So we had one player who had a keyword that said, or like key phrase that said, "not afraid of anything." And so they came into a situation where they were kind of face to face with some wolves, and they're like, "I'm gonna take some like rations and kind of throw it off into the woods to try and distract these wolves. And hey, I've got this experience of not afraid of anything. Can I use that?" And I'm like, "Yeah." So you spend your resource, the hope, um, to add that bonus. I think it was like a +2 bonus or something like that to then the roll. So at that point, she rolled 2d12, 2 different colored dice of d12s, and then added her presence, and then added that +2 from the experience. And if she rolled higher on the dark die, then the GM would get a point of fear that the GM could spend on complications, on a variety of different things. If the light die, and I say that because, as Matt alluded to, they are pulling a lot from the Genesis system, and um, the Star Wars, the Fantasy Flight Star Wars game had a really cool light and dark side mechanic, which I really liked, and I think they took inspiration from that, but it doesn't work in the same way, and I think it is inferior to the Star Wars system. So
and it also has a lot of the same problems as well, I think. And
yeah.
this is, I haven't played Daggerheart, but just looking at statistical probabilities of what happens with the dice in this game is, and this is, I think, the problem with the Genesis system, that GMing it became sometimes absolutely exhausting, because times where there was an unbridled success or an unbridled failure that you just wanted a clear result became fewer and further between, the more dice and more conditional factors that went into the dice roll. Now, there are some that are copied directly from Genesis into this game. I think there's an advantage dice, is there? I think it's called, but like in Genesis, it's called a boost dice or a setback dice. If there's like an environmental thing, you're trying to pick a lock, you use your skill and your dice that you use for you assemble your dice pool, but then you would add a setback dice if like it was dark or if it was raining or if you didn't have the right tools to hand. And the setback dice was mostly blank, but on the sides that it did have something, it had symbols that would make your result worse. Cool system. But one of the problems that Genesis had or has, is that you quite often found yourself absolutely crushing the base roll, but still getting this minor problem.
Yeah.
Now, something like Apocalypse World, Dungeon World, Masks, Monster of the Week, any of those games, you've got an unqualified success, an unqualified failure, and then the middle, the mixed success. And the mixed success comes into play more often than any other roll because
Mhm.
statistically, it's what you're most likely to roll.
Yep.
However, you do very often roll complete failures or complete successes,
Mhm.
and it's really good in those moments. And I found it weird that when rolling your duality dice, is what they're called in Daggerheart,
Mhm.
you could set you're rolling against a difficulty, right? Like in
Yeah,
D&D.
it's a
So
target
the
number. Yeah.
GM says, like, okay, this is quite hard. This is going to be an 18. And you roll an 11 and a 12. I might put my thumb up again. Yeah. You roll an 11 and a 12 on the dice. You
Mhm.
absolutely crush it. It's something that's in your wheelhouse as a character, maybe. Maybe it's something that, like, you have the applicable experience, you have applicable life skills, you use a cool gadget to do it.
Yeah.
But you rolled a 12 on the fear dice, and you rolled
Yep.
an 11 on the hope dice.
Yeah.
You've crushed the roll. You have absolutely sailed past it. But you generated fear that's going to come back and bite you. Now, your stats don't help you roll less fear, right?
Yeah.
It's just random. Like, you will be generating one or the other, whatever you roll the dice. Now, there
Yeah.
is a crit in Daggerheart, which is if you roll doubles, which is statistically way less likely
Mhm.
than rolling an 11 and 12,
Yeah.
which is it made me just feel like you are just going to be endlessly generating these resources, which was a problem I had with Genesis, where we would endlessly be having to add these minor complications when narratively it didn't seem appropriate. So you would always say things like, well, it just takes a bit longer. And I love having to come up with complications. A lot of people
Mhm.
say one of the biggest challenges of Powered by the Apocalypse games are having to always come up with mixed successes and come up with things that will drive the narrative forward, and not just
Mhm.
saying, it takes a bit longer than it probably should have done. I enjoy that challenge. I really love that challenge, and I love it when my players are invested in that and come up with ideas and they pitch in with things.
Yeah.
But the thing is that most games that use a 2d6 plus a stat, success, mixed success, failure, you don't find yourself. There is always those two either ends of the spectrum that you can say, well, this went wrong. The GM's going to tell you what happened, or man, you crushed that roll. Tell me how it went down.
Yeah.
And those moments feel like they are slightly tempered by
Mm.
the hope and fear system, that you can absolutely crush the roll using your experience, everything about your character, using your experience with a biggie. I love the experience system, and I'd like to talk more about that.
Yeah.
You can crush it and come up with this cool moment, but still you've just given the games master something that in the moment they're going to struggle to find like an appropriate use for. And then I don't know, did you find yourself banking it a lot, or
Yeah, I did. I
yeah?
did. Yeah.
Okay.
Because I had one player who I don't think rolled a hope the entire session.
Mm,
Like every roll was generating fear. So by the end of the first scene, I had 5 or 6 fear sitting in front of me, most of which was from that player. And one of the pieces of feedback that he provided was, man, it really sucked to get a like 25 on my roll, because I rolled, because that literally happened to him where he rolled a 12 on the fear die and 11 on the hope die and added his, +2, and was like, I've got a 25. And I'm like, man, you crushed it. I'll take that fear. Thank you very much. And he's like, ah. And then what that led to, and maybe I was holding back because we were playing a playtest and I wanted to get through all of the different scenes. I mean, we did the quick start playtest adventure,
Hmm.
and which, first of all, side note, that is beautifully designed.
Yeah, very good.
The character cards, the character sheets, and then there's a thing that you can print out that you cut down the middle, and then you slide out to either side of your character sheet that has little boxes of text that point to the different parts of the character sheet
I really like that a
with
lot. Yeah.
with rules explanations, and I was like, this is brilliant. Like, that is absolutely amazing, and the entire table was very impressed with that. But we I was trying to move things along because I didn't want to get bogged down in the first scene by being like, well, another wolf comes out of the the woods, and now you have to deal with that thing. And so I did bank a bunch of that fear. But then the other thing, and going back to my comment earlier about feeling hampered by the fear system and waiting for enough fear to make something dramatic happen, I also felt like I had so much fear that I was like, I don't want to be a jerk
Hmm.
and just be like, all right, here we go, suckers. Like, I'm going to spend all this, and a meteor falls from the sky.
And
But
fear isn't capped, but for each player, hope is capped at 5 per person. Is that right?
something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so once we got into combat, I was like, oh, okay, well, I can spend fear to roll with advantage. So literally every attack I made, I rolled with advantage because I had plenty of fear because they kept generating it for me. And I was like, cool, all right, I'll roll for advantage. And yeah, I'll use this fear to activate this ability. Um, but the characters, like the combat was super interesting because you don't have initiative. They don't have an initiative. They have something that I think is really cool, which is this action tracker,
Hmm.
where every time you act in the narrative, you have to place a token on that action tracker, and then the GM turns in that, like, basically spends those tokens to activate their creatures.
Hmm.
But they can only do that when a character rolls with fear or fails a roll. Now, in the entire 3-hour session that we played, I think the players only rolled 2 failures the entire night. I mean, it was, maybe their dice were just hot, but I feel like they were rolling fine and still succeeding and overcoming the target numbers. But they were generating a lot of fear. And so I had this fear resource that I'm like, okay, well, I can spend that to make my guys attack, or do this or that. But then they were like, all right, well, I'm gonna act. Boom, I'll put my token on there. I absolutely destroy this goblin, ambusher, and I'm like, okay, cool, that's fine. It's all good. And then somebody else is like, cool, I'm gonna act too. And then they put their token on there, and then roll, and then got like rolled with fear. And I was like, all right, I'm gonna spend these 2 tokens before my creatures are all dead. Um, and I like the idea of that system,
Hmm.
but suddenly I had 2 currencies to think about and keep track of
Mm.
instead of just the fear. And so it wasn't challenging, but it definitely it took a certain amount of focus. But then, because I was focused on those 2 currencies, I also felt like I didn't do a great job of managing the table
Mm.
and making sure that everyone got to act. And that's what this style of system needs. It needs your game master to have good table management, but also the players need to have good table management and be aware of each other and be able to be like, okay, I know I just did like 3 things, and Bob over on the other side of the table hasn't said a word. I'm going to be like, hey, Bob, what are you doing over there? Because if you have a player who is a little bit more mild mannered and is a little bit quieter, it is really easy for them to lose out on the opportunity to act. And as the game master, I felt it was my responsibility to make sure that we were moving back and forth. But what I ended up doing was essentially what I do in most Powered by the Apocalypse games that I run, or like Blades in the Dark, where I'm like, all right, who wants to act first? And then, somebody volunteers, they act, and then I'm like, all right, turn to the next person and say, what are you doing? And if they are like, well, I'm not really sure, I'm like, cool, get back to me when you know what you want to do. Turn to the next person. What are you doing? And so it's a lot of me as the game master being like, hey, you, what are you doing? And then people can chime in with, oh, can I help with that? Or, this, that, or the other thing. And that works fine. I have no problem with that.
Mm.
But I'm trying to do that and also being like, okay, I've got fear, but I can't spend that until I spend the action token to activate a creature. And then I also have to tell the players, hey, don't forget to put your token on the action tracker so I can do stuff.
Yeah, it's a lot of. There seems to be a lot of bookkeeping, even though
Yeah.
it seems like an elegant solution.
Hmm.
But I think it exists in there because a lot of the people who will be playing this game might be thrown by a combat with no initiative, no turn order, no
Yeah.
limits on what you can do. And when I first played Dungeon World, for example, which this game shares a lot of DNA with,
Hmm.
um, I found it incredibly freeing
Yeah.
that it would be narratively appropriate for one of my characters to have another go at the monster they just missed, or to follow up the amazing attack that they just did with another one, because some of the more less combat focused characters in the background are just getting ready. It makes perfect sense for the
Yeah.
character that is inevitably played by my friend Katie, whose real only role playing goal is to run into a room and hack things to death as quickly as possible with an axe. No matter what game we're playing, she'll always end up with an axe. So much so that we bought her a real life axe for her birthday, and it's so freeing. And I'll give you a good example of this. Actually, we
Hmm.
played a Dungeon World campaign for 2 years, and it was me and my three friends, Katie, Andy, and Lou, and found the combat very liberating, and everyone very quickly settled into a rhythm of what their characters would be doing in a combat and sharing that spotlight, which was really
Hmm.
amazing. During lockdown, we went back and played a one shot of the Star Wars role playing game, the FFG one, and we got into a combat encounter. I ran it for the group, and Katie was like, "I'm going to run into this room. I've seen the Rhodian behind that crate. I'm going to run up to him and hit him with my axe straight away." And I had to say, "Well, did you get your axe out?" And she was like, "Well, no." And I was like, "Well, that's a maneuver. You're also not close enough to get to the." And it's woolly. The ranges in Star Wars is woolly, but she was
Sure.
quite far away. And
Yeah.
I was like, "It's probably going to be two maneuvers to actually get over there. So you can either get your axe out and not be close enough, or you could get close enough but not have your axe out." And I was like,
Yeah.
this feels bad. Like, and we ended up just kind of hand waving most of the combat because like
Mhm.
we'd got so used to it. And I think the what I hope comes out of Daggerheart's playtest is that players who aren't used to rigid turn orders, initiative, ranges, all of those
Mhm.
things find this as a way into it. But what
Mhm.
I really hope for is that maybe they don't need some of those crutches. Maybe they don't need this action tracker,
Yeah.
or the GM having to spend fear to activate things and trust that the GM knows it's the right time for the bad guys to take a turn. Because in games with levels, it can become quite easy for certain people to stroll into a room full of monsters and just kill them all like quite easily. And it's
Mhm.
having to scale encounters is you know a real skill, I think. And trusting that you that the GM can do that without having to have this mechanical assistance in place
Hmm.
is something that I kind of hope that the game leans into more.
Yeah. I agree. And that's why, like, I go back to my feeling of that this game is designed to introduce people to other games, uh, but also like just go play Dungeon World. Like it's there,
Hmm.
and it like lots of people went from playing D&D to playing Dungeon World and were like, this is great.
Mm.
You know, I think the first time I ran Blades in the Dark, I don't know that I had played much. Like Blades in the Dark was probably like the first indie game that I really kind of delved into and played. And yeah, I mean, I feel like the first Blades in the Dark campaign that I ran, I probably did some things wrong because I was thinking from a, you know, Pathfinder D&D mechanicalist mindset. But guess what? I learned that there were different ways to do it by continuing to run it and continuing to play it and being like, well, that didn't feel good. Like
Mm.
that didn't seem like things were as enjoyable as they should, or that the system wasn't quite working in the way that it should. So let's try something else. Like let's make a different choice and try to engage with the game on its own merits. And so I feel like having this sort of intermediary system that doesn't really do either the narrative or the crunchy bit really well is a little bit of a disservice to gamers looking to branch out from
Mm.
D&D.
Yeah, and I want the people who this game is aimed at
Mm.
to have something that is not just D&D with the serial numbers filed off, and
Yeah.
not just play Dungeon World.
Mhm.
You know, I said to you before we recorded this for the first time that some of this felt like a more bloated version of Dungeon World. I perhaps don't feel like that, and having now spent a bit more time with the book, it feels like a more like Dungeon World is a game. I love Dungeon World, but it's showing its age. It's quite old now,
Mhm.
and Powered by the Apocalypse games have moved on. And you know, if they were to do a second version of that, you know, it would be very different probably. And there's a lot more design space to explore in that.
Mhm.
But this game kind of doesn't do that. It doesn't take what Dungeon World does and build on it to make it better. It takes elements of Dungeon World, elements of other things, and
Mhm.
tries to have its cake and eat it. It tries to do so much, and I think that that is actually probably quite a good approach for a beta playtest to have. You don't want to see huge gaps in this game. You don't want to see big empty spaces of where like, oh, we'll get to this or whatever. This is not a
Yeah.
priority. You want to see a lot of ideas. You want to throw
Mhm.
it all out on the porch and see if the cat eats it. And you know, it's I'm trying to sneak phrases past Steve that he thinks are genuine British phrases. But yeah, that's what you want. I
Uh,
want to open a playtest of a new game that is brimming with ideas, that has a
mhm.
lot of creativity behind it. And let's like, you know, be real. The lead designer of this game is Spencer Stark, who knows how to design a fucking game. Like
Yeah.
designer Alice is Missing. You know, he knows his onions and
Mhm.
knows exactly how to design a game. I'm pretty sure he already knows, or the team behind this already knows what they weren't sure of, or like what
Mhm.
isn't perhaps the strongest elements of it, and they also know probably what's the thing that is going to be that'll excite them the most.
Mhm.
And I wonder whether, you know, I wonder what the next iteration of this is going to be like.
Yeah.
Um, we'll quickly get into character creation, because character creation takes up an awful lot of this playtest document. I think there's 75 pages of character creation.
Yeah.
It's pretty interesting, actually. I think they've gone for a lot of well, it's interesting in one sense, it's depressingly familiar in another sense. Like, you know, I opened this book, read it through, and they were like, we're taking these new approaches, you can do all this, and then it talks about how they make characters. There's a refreshing move away from some antiquated language around characters, which is nice. And then we get into classes, bang, bard, rogue, cleric, ranger, druid, warrior,
Yeah.
sorcerer, wizard. I'm like, fine. like, like,
Yeah.
we've had 50 years of these assholes. Like, give it. I know there is one class, which is like a literal angel,
Yeah.
which is weird that that's a class and not one of the heritages, but whatever. But I kind of, and each one has got two schools basically, two flavors of them, and they're all you know what they are, right?
Yeah.
The ranger's a beastmaster or they're a hunter. You know what they are. Um, and you pick your class, which is not that interesting. But then
Yeah.
you pick your heritage, which is your basically your genetic makeup, and the usual standards are there. You've got your human, your elf, your dwarf, your halflings,
Hmm.
but then you've got catman, cowman, goatman,
Frogman.
frogman, mushroom
Yeah.
man. And when I saw the mushroom man, I was like, that feels a bit like Wildsea. And then I looked in the credits, and the designer of Wildsea is in the credits of this game. And they must have been like, "Get us the mushroom guy on the phone
Hmm.
now. We need some. We need the fun guy in
Yep.
this team." Hey, so you've got your orcs, you can be fairies in this game, demons, dragon guys, all those good folks. I'm sorry, Steve, I had to. I couldn't resist.
You got me.
I
You really
did,
got me with
yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah. And then in addition to that, so you've got your
Community.
class, your heritage, and then you have your community, which
Mhm.
is kind of like the societal status you were born in too.
Yeah.
Um, I thought that was quite an interesting way of codifying those things.
Hmm.
But then it gets a little more complicated because each class has a domain, and each domain has two aspects to it. I thought that was actually a really interesting concept on its own.
I agree.
And they come in cards, and they're printable cards for this game. And I think when
Yeah.
the game comes out, we'll probably have like a deck of cards for this.
Yeah.
You mix and match these kind of character abilities. Huge fan of cards at the table that just clearly say things,
Yeah.
that are their, traits and abilities that are easy to unlock. You don't want to search through 2 pages of a sheet. Bang, it's on a card. Done. Then you've got your experiences on top of that, which I love that idea. That is very reminiscent of City in the Mist. They
Mm.
use a tag system, which are sometimes things as straightforward as bouncer or like bodyguard or something, and that could be your experience. But then also, like Steve said, it could be like nothing to lose, or not afraid of the dark.
Yeah.
Those things that are a little bit more evocative instantly puts players in a more creative mindset, thinking about how to use it. It sucks that they have to use a hope to activate those things.
Yep.
Those things are apparently innate abilities or experience that they've learned on, but they have to have this resource to use it.
Yeah.
I
Well,
mean, I haven't played it, but like, I
if
kind of
if you're
it feels bad.
if you're gonna put your resource, if you're gonna put a resource into your game, you gotta be able to spend it on something. I mean,
Yeah.
you gotta have something to spend it on. So I feel like I don't feel like at any point any of the players, except maybe the one, and I think he did roll some hope,
Hmm.
um, or he had built him hope, where you could kind of like exchange, you could spend one hope and get two hope, or I forget exactly what it was, but I don't feel like at any point they were lacking for the hope, other than about half the table uh, didn't quite get that they were supposed to take a hope every time they rolled the higher die.
Mm.
So we got like halfway through the game and we're like, oh, you should have more hope because every time you rolled that die higher, you should mark that down on your sheet. That's just a kind of experience with the game and kind of figuring that's standard first time playing a game. You're going to mess up half the rules,
Yeah, of course.
but I didn't ever feel like they were like, oh, I can't do anything because I don't have any hope to spend.
Mm.
So I would say that's a positive of the duality dice, is like, yeah, it generated a lot of fear for me as the game master, but I feel like it also had as much potential to generate hope for the players,
Mm.
and
Yeah.
they were spending it and using their abilities, and yeah, the cards were great. Like them having the ability to have the cards out in front of them and very fourth edition D&D design of like, you know, powers on cards that you're like, cool, I'm going to activate this ability, you know, my whirling slash or whatever. And, you know, I spend one hope and I can do this, I can roll my attack, and then I also get to knock people back, you know, 5 feet or whatever. So that was really cool.
Hmm. Do you think that there's perhaps, because you played with the pre-gen characters from the quick start, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Um, is there potentially too much on these character sheets? Because the one thing that immediately puts a lot of people off playing D&D is that the character sheet looks overwhelming in the sense that
Yeah.
there's a lot of numbers on there. And to be fair, that is not a D&D specific problem.
Yeah.
Even for some of the most elegantly designed indie games, some of the character sheets, there's a lot going on there.
Yeah.
Do you think that with the addition of domain cards, with the addition of like faction traits, heritage traits, community traits, all of those things
Yeah.
add up to too much, or is it just right?
I think it's going to depend on the table,
Mm-hmm.
because I think for some people, absolutely. Our table managed it all pretty well. I'd say they didn't necessarily use all of the stuff that was on the sheet, um, which, you know, happens, but I feel like there was definitely a lot for them to learn and manage. But also, it was, and this goes back to the playtest packet being very well designed, it was nicely laid out and explained in such a way that it didn't feel, I think, onerous for anybody at the table to be
Mm.
like, okay, I can do this ability, I can do that. And I would say the probably the notable thing for me is that a level 1 character in Daggerheart felt like about the same power level as a level 3 character in 5th edition D&D,
Mm-hmm.
which frankly, it feels about right to me, because typically when we play D&D, you know, we've played enough games at this point that we're like, all right, let's just start at level 3 and, you know, start with some abilities. Um, so you don't have as much of that learning ability where you can learn one ability and then you get a second ability at level 2, and then you know, so you have more stuff to learn up front. But I also felt like it did feel good, and like the characters and the players felt like they could do a lot of different things, and because of that they were having fun with it.
Mm.
And it was like the combat and stuff like that was fairly dynamic and quick. You know, I think combat was maybe 15-20 minutes,
Oh,
and a lot of that was
that's the
because
sweet
we
spot,
were,
right?
oh yeah, and a lot of that is because I think we could have done it in 5 minutes
Mm.
if everybody, you know, had played the system and knew what they were supposed to do. So a lot of it was like reading abilities and being like, oh yeah, I'm going to use this, and you know, okay, I have to spend a hope, so let me mark that off, and then like, okay, it says I can do this, this, and this. All right, so I'm going to do that, and then they have to, you know. So I feel like combat flowed really smoothly, and a part of that was because the characters had a lot of things that they could do,
Mm.
and not all of them were combat abilities. So, you know, there were some non-combat abilities as well that came in the various sort of exploration scenes that we had. So I feel like it was not too much for our table, but I could see it being too much for some tables.
I think that that's probably my own bias talking, in that
Mm,
like anyone who's played any amount of D&D probably looks at the Daggerheart character sheets and is like, yeah, this looks quite clean, and like I know what these things are supposed to represent, and I know what these
yeah,
things do. Whereas me, you know, your characters. I mean, I've played Starforge now for 3 years, and I keep forgetting that my characters have got assets and skills they can use. I just, you know, sometimes I always look and think, well, this a little bit like our co-op rules in Dead Belt. I find out
yeah,
after the fact that yeah, that would have been quite handy.
mm,
Um, but you know, as characters in yeah, as players of games that have a lot more of those things built into the basic game, I think that there's an awful lot of people who won't be put off by that, and perhaps I don't fall into that group because I
yeah.
just, you know, haven't played enough. Um, What else did you really like about the game, Steve? One thing that I really liked is that there's just a different type of language about a lot of the things in the game. When it talks
Mm.
about healing and recovery, for example, the thing that it was a little bit like a slap around the face that I'd never really twigged before, but it's something I see all the time and I accept from the games that I enjoy playing. That it says when you take a long rest, heal these hit points and narratively describe how it happens. And I was thinking, well, in fifth edition, that probably just says a long rest of X amount of hours heals you these amount of hit points, or you roll
Yeah.
the hit point dice, and that's it. It's such a small thing,
Mm-hmm.
but again, it goes back to having the joy of discovering those things for the first time, right? That like if you're a player who has just taken into account that right, well, we're going to reach a village, we're gonna hole up somewhere, and we're just going to mechanically recover these hit points on our thing and that on our sheet, and that's it, right? Now it's part of the story you're telling,
Mm-hmm.
and those are where you have little moments because you're explaining a long rest. It's not an action scene. It's not a dynamic, particularly thrilling scene. It's most likely going to be a quiet scene between characters,
Mm-hmm.
and I really love that people are getting excited. It certainly excited me when I read it. That people are finding excited for something that in other role-playing games, shall we say, to use the language of Daggerheart, pretty much just want you to take the mechanical benefit and not worry too much about what's going on in the story. And I think that's what I liked about seeing people who were excited about the game, and I feel like they were realizing that there's so much about games that have dramatic potential and interesting story potential that in the games they've been playing have just been a roll of a dice and a number
Mm.
going up.
Yeah. Yeah, it was interesting at our table because one player in particular got a little hung up on that,
Mm.
and was kind of getting a little, maybe a little bit for effect, but like a little upset over like, well, you know, I have to describe, everything that I'm doing. I can't
There's always
just
one
say,
player at the table, isn't there, who's like this?
I was just like, I can't just say, I swing, I attack. I have to describe how I'm doing this. And I think the reason he was kind of getting a little outspoken about that is because we do that stuff anyways. And so it was maybe a little bit of the uh, you know, like, you don't need to tell me that, dude.
Mm.
Like, I already know this. And that's where I started to think about it from the standpoint of like, maybe this is designed for people who are coming from mechanical first games and who don't have that narrative mindset as a like, hey, just remember your characters are living in a world. Don't forget to look into that world and tell us what happens. And for you and me, I mean, we've played Surfforge at this point. Almost every move, ends with envision it. And I've started to take that on as kind of a mantra of like, all right, I'm going to describe a bunch of like mechanical stuff, and then it's like, all right, let's envision this, and then go into the narrative and be like, all right, let's work through what's actually going on in the fiction. And in my show, like, that has become for me a way to remind myself to not get stuck in a mode of, all right, I'm just going to jump from mechanic to mechanic to mechanic,
Mm.
and I'm going to actually remember that I'm telling a story here and I need to dip back into that story to explain what happens and to explore what happens next.
Mm.
And so, because I have introduced a bunch of indie games to my group that have more fiction first tendencies, I think that we don't need that explanation to be given license to describe and have that quiet scene when you're trying to rest. And that's why I think partially this game is not made for us,
Mm.
and that's okay. Um, but I also like the idea of it being in there as a way to remind people that, like, hey, you just had a really intense couple of hours of fighting monsters, dodging falling boulders in a dungeon and all this stuff. Take a moment, check in with your characters, check in with each other and be like, hey, like, you were on death's door 20 minutes ago. How you doing?
Mm.
And I think that is overall a really positive thing and something that everybody should be doing more, whether you play D&D or play, the most obscure story game out there. Like, you're telling a story.
Yeah.
Check in with your players, check in with your characters, and envision it.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Um, to sum up, Steve,
Hmm.
and we've kind of touched upon it and danced around it now. Who is this game for? And I think that's a question that a lot of critiques of this game ask, and
Mhm.
the answer is kind of not obvious. Um, my surprise is that like the game isn't for me.
Yeah.
If I was to try and play another game that scratched this itch of an adventuring party doing vaguely fantasy things, there are other games that I would play first. I'm really excited about playing Legend in the Mist when it
Mhm.
comes out next year. I think that has a really interesting take on the genre, and the City of Mist system is something I've never actually played, but really have enjoyed reading about and learning about. But I found myself quite surprised that like if my I think after reading Daggerheart, if my friends contacted me and said, "Would you play in a six part game of Daggerheart?" I'd probably say yes. Whereas if someone asked, "Would I play in a six-part D&D?" I would be like, "What, one fight against some rats? That's that's the little joke about D&D there." Also, I'd just like to say that I rag on D&D a lot, but I would never begrudge anyone their fun playing D&D. If that's the game you love, then more power to you. And I would never try and take that away from anyone. It's not my cup of tea, but that's absolutely fine. If it's yours, fantastic.
Mhm.
But like the things that I actively dislike about D&D are absent from Daggerheart. And
Yeah.
people always say, a lot of what I dislike about D&D is the heavy reliance on combat and how the combat actually works. And then you have people say, well, you don't have to have combat in D&D. You can play D&D by not rolling any dice at all. And I'm like, well, there are lots of other games that do all that other stuff in a
Yeah.
more interesting way
Yeah.
than D&D. So there's no way that I'm going to end up playing D&D probably. But this game, I'm like, those rough edges, the things that I bump up against on D&D that I find hard to get past, aren't they don't exist here.
Mhm.
And I would play this, but the game isn't for me. But I still can't quite work out exactly who it's for. I can't put myself in the mindset of someone who knows about more narrative games and doesn't play another one instead of this.
Yeah.
I can't put myself in that mindset of the ardent D&D fan who loves to measure ranges of spells and slots and enjoys fighting rats for 5 hours. Um and looking at this and thinking that I would be really excited about it. I can't quite picture who's playing this. Can you?
Well, I kind of have a question to pose to you in the hopes of answering that,
Mm-hmm.
which is, and I'm not sure about this because as much as Critical Role, portrays itself as being a group of friends playing a game around a table,
Mm-hmm.
they are also a company.
Yep.
and they have bills to pay, and
Hmm.
they've got staff to pay and all that stuff. So I think certainly they have to make certain business decisions that don't necessarily directly serve the core group of players that make up the cast of Critical Role.
Hmm.
But I have often wondered if they, as a group of players, would be happier playing a whole slew of other games other than D&D. But they seem to enjoy themselves
Hmm.
in the games of D&D that they play. And so, I mean, I'm kind of starting to wonder, like, is this game designed for them?
Mm.
And from that standpoint, if they like it and play it and do their thing, which, let's be honest, they are professionally charming.
Hmm.
Like, that is, they get paid uh to do voices and be, you know, professionally charming. So if they were to run a campaign of Daggerheart, I'm sure that it would be fun and engaging, and people would draw lots of character art and all sorts of different things. And so I wonder if they're the target audience for this game, with the thinking that their audience will follow them wherever they go.
Mm.
What do you think?
It's interesting because I know they have played other games, but I
Hmm?
don't know how. I don't keep up with Critical Role anywhere near enough to know um, what has done well and what
You
is
don't watch
successful.
4.5 hours of some group of people playing D&D every week?
One fight against some rats. Well, I think there was a session that was 7 or 8 hours. I think they put out towards the end of their last season. I was like,
Yeah.
oh, God,
Yeah.
yeah. I it's the people who are really into that. I get why people will watch 7 hours of that, because you feel like you're with friends at the table and you're hanging
Yeah.
out and you're playing games. But that's personally not what kind of AP I'm into. I'm into like the total opposite of that. But I don't keep up with it enough to know if anything they've tried has been successful. I do remember watching a bit of them try and play Monster Hearts
Hmm.
and getting a little bit tongue tied of how that worked, and thinking, oh, it really is, it really can be baked into you, a system. Do you know what I mean? And like
Yeah.
I've talked about this before, but my experiences of role playing games is kind of ass backwards. Like, I didn't play D&D, was like the fifth or sixth game that I played and bounced off it pretty much straight away. Whereas a lot of people, it's their gateway into role playing games, and
Hmm.
then they find other things later. So it was a shock to me to see people struggling with something that for me is, well, it's basically, it would be like watching me play D&D. Right. It was just that kind of alien, I guess.
Hmm.
um I do know that their live stream, or the session zero they had for their Daggerheart campaign, and the character creation stuff was really popular. A lot of people watched that.
Yeah.
It would be really interesting to see how it goes when they actually kick off this campaign, or when they actually get into it proper. I honestly don't think a lot of their fans will care,
Yeah.
like, what system they play. If it makes the stories they want to tell easier without the mechanics having to interfere and them get miniatures out and get a grid out and whatever it is,
Yeah.
then maybe that's it. The audience beyond that, I don't know. It's interesting because, like, people always say, well, if you don't like D&D, play something else, and then inevitably they play Pathfinder, which is
Right.
another crunchy,
Yeah.
mechanics first game. And it's Coke and Pepsi, isn't it, essentially?
Hmm.
And what I really hope for Daggerheart, because I want Daggerheart to succeed. I really do want Daggerheart to
Agreed.
succeed. Um, what I hope for is it ends up being more than the sum of its parts. And its
Mm.
parts at the minute, sometimes this rule book is a beta test. We'll say it again. Sometimes it feels like pages pulled from other rule books stitched together, You kind of flip flop. Sometimes it's quite jarring going from, hey, you can do whatever you want, to bang, here's 19 class abilities that you can unlock. That said, like, a lot of the leveling up and how some of that is done and gaining new experiences is really nice. But what I'm saying is that the vestiges of some of those games that are based, that are spawned off war games, for example, with tactical approaches to combat, they are still in there. And I keep coming back to the idea that I just want this to be its own thing that has its own identity, and people can say, "Oh, I played." If you don't like D&D, play Pathfinder. I don't want it to be like, if you don't like D&D, play Daggerheart. Daggerheart. I want it to be its own thing. I want it to be. If you want to make a fantasy adventuring game, wonderful. But the whole point of making something new is to make it distinct. Yeah. And I just hope it has the bravery to be more distinct than it is now. That, like, they take some more risks, because I think that the things that excite people about this game are perhaps the riskier elements of it. And I think that they should really lean into that. But this is, again, my bias talking, but yeah, it's hard to tell. I kind of would love to see the next iteration of this game, to see the next version. I don't know when it's due. I don't know how far along in the design process it is, the names they have attached to this, the resources they have behind it. I assume that they will kickstart this, or backer kit this when it comes out, and it will. Will they? Will they go straight to?
I don't think they will. I think
they've done a lot of Kickstarters. They did their, like, animated show and stuff like that, didn't they? Or
but that was. I feel like that was before they really became kind of a force to be reckoned with company. And I feel like I don't think any of the other stuff that Darrington Press has released has been Kickstarted or crowdfunded.
No, I think you're right.
I think it's just it's just published, released. So I don't know. I mean, it's possible that they will, but I get the sense that they are funding the development of this with plenty of money that they make from the streaming and whatever other, like, media deals that they have, because I don't think they make plenty from the streaming, but probably, like, they make so much more off of whatever, the Legend of Vox Machina stuff on Amazon and just all that stuff. So I don't know. I don't think that they're going to crowdfund it. I think that they're just going to release it, and it'll happen one day, and we'll be all like, oh, okay, it's out.
It's here.
Yeah. But
and I should probably play it.
Yeah. I genuinely, like, we enjoyed playing Daggerheart at the table, and I think we came to the conclusion similarly that it wasn't made for us, that the types of games that we like to play, we play D&D, but, like, we play D&D our way, and we play indie games, and we are a group of people that like to tell stories, and so we think of things from a narrative standpoint and from a character arc standpoint, and from a place of, like, where's the drama in this scene, and and also where's the comedy, but, like, how can we engage with the story that is being told and developed at the table. And I think that as a group, we felt like there was too much hand holding and too much crunch related to telling the story for us specifically. And that's why I think it's not made for us, but I do think it's made for somebody. And I think it will find an audience with some people. But I agree with you in that I hope that they lean into some of the more innovative ideas and really try to explore that space a little bit more. And I mean, I 100% will sit down and play, whether it's the next test or it's the final version of it, because I'm curious. I want to see where it's changed, how it's changed,
Mm,
and what parts the designers felt were worth fighting for and keeping, and what parts softened or changed or fell away entirely. So
mm.
I 100% am going to sit down and play this game at some point. And you know, Matt, maybe we have to figure out
Yeah,
something for that in the future.
yeah, yeah. We'll probably have to, won't we? One thing I'm curious about is the kind of fluff element of it,
Mm.
because a lot of what draws me to games is like what the game is actually about.
Hmm.
And again, one of the reasons I kind of, you know, bounced off D&D is that it's mostly generic fantasy land, or the, you know, the even the more specific fantasy settings are, they're not that interesting to me, or there's more interesting options available. But the fluff here is largely absent in the main rule book. And like I say, a lot of the heritages are, you know, archetypes and you know, generic staples from fantasy. You've got orcs, dwarves, elves, humans, all those other things. No amount of frogmen is gonna is gonna disguise that you're leaning on the classic fantasy archetypes.
Hmm.
Was there a lot more in the playtest?
There was there was a little bit, but I feel like it did that thing that a lot of narrative style games do, is like, you know, ask questions the players.
Mm,
And so it basically takes place in the Sablewood, which, you know, has a little bit of a description in the main book, in the playtest book, and then there's not a whole lot in the actual like quick start adventure. And so, you know, as part of being a game master, I just turned to one of the players and said, "All right, like, what do you see around you?"
mm,
And the player said, "Well, the trees aren't glowing anymore." And I was like, "All right, we are in it. Let's go."
yeah.
So, you know, that's where I hope they lean into that, where it's like, all right, we can put a little bit of fluff in there, but also leaving it open-ended enough that your version of this world and my version of this world and somebody else's version of this world have similarities,
Mm,
but also have differences.
yeah.
And that's something I love about a game like Blades in the Dark. That's something I love about Ironsworn. Like, we can have similar truths in Ironsworn and have complete ideas and execution of what those truths mean for the setting. And similarly, I love watching or listening to Blades in the Dark APs, and they talk about, you know, the Leviathan hunters, or they talk
Mm,
about, you know, this, that, or the other thing. And I go, oh, that's interesting. Like, it's different in my world, in my version of Duskwall, but it's also the same. Like, there are similarities, there are differences,
still Duskwall,
and
yeah.
it's still Duskwall. So it is. So that's what I hope that they do with the fluff, is like just enough
Hmm.
to give you a sense that this is a world that you can dig your teeth into. But then, if you're going to do a narrative style game, give it to the players and let them define the boundaries and the various things within the world, because that's where you get a setting and an experience that your players and you are really invested in and engaged with, is when they're like, that's not the Sablewood, this place that I read about in the rule book. No, that's the Sablewood where trees used to glow when I was a child growing up in this area, and I used to come here every fall to watch the leaves float upward, whatever it is, right?
Mm,
Like that creates a level of connection and identity that just having a fully fleshed out world leaves it kind of cold.
yeah. And there's some cool map tools in Daggerheart, the map creation tools, and they name check the Quiet Year as being an
Mm.
influence on those. And I really like collaboratively building a world, and maps are so cool, aren't they? When you get to like draw them with everyone, and yeah, there's a lot of potential in there to kind
Yeah.
of make it your own thing. Anyone in the comments has played Daggerheart? Any thoughts on Daggerheart? Has anything myself or Steve said made you want to try it, or made you not want to try it? What do you think about this hot topic? Do you even care? Like, has the 2 week period of excitement elapsed? But yeah, I'm genuinely fascinated to know who is turned on by this game and who is put off. Um,
I'm really excited about it, whenever this comes out, and then the MCDM RPG comes out as like these two reactions to the uh Wizards controversy, and like they are going to be very different games
mhm.
with very different audiences, and I'm excited to look at them both and be like, all right, like what what are you doing that's different, and what are you doing that's too similar or maybe similar enough to D&D, and how do those things interact with the space and with fans of tabletop role-playing games.
Yeah, next year could see Daggerheart, the MCDM game, and Legends in the Mist, which have all got are D&D alternatives. Legends in the Mist is the most different out of all of them.
Hmm.
MCDM is the more tactical kind of one, and Daggerheart
Yep.
seems to be the thing that's in the middle.
Yep.
Be really interesting to see who latches onto those games. I think obviously Legends in the Mist is flying under the radar, but has a whole legions of fans who play City in the Mist, and
Hmm.
the cyberpunk version of that game, which I forget the name of. But yeah, I'd be really interested to see if it makes any difference at all. Because I mean, let's face it, like D&D is the most popular game in the world.
It's going to continue to be.
Hasbro Wizards of the Coast will not notice a jot of the
Yeah.
people who leave. Whether it doesn't quite dominate the cultural conversation, probably not going to make a difference. Whether it will change people's ideas at the table, maybe some of the newer players are still going to find their way to D&D because it's so ubiquitous. You can buy
Hmm.
it. They say that in London you're never more than like 5 feet away from a rat. Uh, you are never more than about 50 yards away from a copy of D&D 5th edition. No
Yeah.
matter where you go, somewhere will be selling it near you. Whereas, you can't say that about, you know, Monster of the Week, for example. It's just a
Yeah.
sad fact of commerce and, supply and demand. Let us know in the comments what you thought of this, what you think of Daggerheart, if you're excited for it, if you're trepidatious, or, do you even care? We have got a topic next month, so we won't be playing Dead Belt. You'll be sad to know. But yeah, until then, goodbye.
See ya.